So thank you so much for attending. And if you were somebody that received notifications prior to this webinar that were false, saying that we were having a webinar when we actually weren't, and you still tried to dial in and you came back anyway, thank you so much. And I apologize for those technical difficulties that we had and those erroneous notifications. So I appreciate your patience. Happy to see you here today. And hopefully we can just do a real quick recap of where we're at and what you can be doing to position yourself for success with this upcoming Oasis Plus GWAC that everybody's waiting for with bated breath. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and dive in. I do want to give you just a little bit of background about Trident. So we are a service-disabled, better-known small business that was founded in 2008. We're headquartered in Southern California, but if you visited our website, if you're just listening to me talk, you probably know that we are a lot of military veterans and military spouses, so we have a global presence. We have people distributed across the world in different time zones, which we use to our advantage when we're supporting full business development life cycle for our customers. So everything from doing business intelligence and research, helping you find opportunities, to actually helping you position for those opportunities through some dedicated capture management. And then, eventually transitioning to the proposal phase of support, right, where we're helping you prepare that response and managing the process so that you can submit a compliant, compelling proposal that is competitive on time. We use a flexible and scalable team approach to the way that we work with our clients, and we are offering some Oasis packages, which I'll talk to you about at the end. But we know you're not here to hear the sales pitch; you're here to get the information. So we totally respect that, and happy to share that with you, just based on our insights and what we've seen in the past. So I am Rebecca Wayland. I am Trident's GWAC lead. So I've been on the Polaris videos, doing Oasis Plus. We're going to be keeping an eye out for Alliant 3. And happy to help you through this process. I love being able to dig in on topics and get smart on them. And there is a wealth of things to talk about when it comes to scorecard evaluations and GSA's GWACs. So that's why I'm talking to you today. When I'm not doing GWAC things, I support the market research and business intelligence team at Trident. I'm also one of the proposal managers. I do a lot of tech editing. I'm in Hawaii right now. So if you engage Trident and you want some overnight support, I might be one of the people that gets pulled into the team as a resource, just because I am offset from your time zone. So we've just found that it's a really great way to expand the proposal calendars if we can, tag off with other people on our team who are further east or very far west, depending on your perspective, to just give you some more time in that 30-day cycle, or what's normally a 30-day cycle. So you can reach out to me at any point. This is my email. It's really simple, Rebecca@tridentproposals.com. Happy to talk to you about anything Oasis or proposal related. Just get a sense of where you're at and field those questions. So today, what we're going to talk about, we're going to do a quick update on Oasis Plus, where we're at. I'm going to give you some recommendations on things that you can be doing now while we wait for the final. Also going to share some thoughts I have around the scorecard and the contingencies that exist there, and also some areas to watch that could really drive some changes in your potential score or eligibility. So just things to be aware of. Can't predict the future, obviously, but if I were in your shoes, these are the things that I'd want to flag for follow-up. And then just ending with some key takeaways, right? Kind of closing it out with what you can do. If you remember nothing else, make sure you take these takeaways, and then ways that we can work together if you choose to, or if you decide that you need to engage additional support, just some options that are available to you. Okay, so in terms of where we're at with the overview and timeline, so obviously this is the GWAC, looking for this 10-year continuous IDIQ. Still planning for these 6 separate IDIQ vehicles. So the unrestricted, which is not exclusively for large business, but we expect to see most of the large businesses there. And then the 5 sort of set-aside rules. So the total small business set-aside, women-owned small business set-aside, service-disabled veteran-owned small business set-aside, hub zone, and 8A. This no contract ceiling that you see in bold, that's still kind of up for debate. I don't think it's been formally approved, but that is what GSA is hoping to achieve here in the contract setup. They were able to get it for Polaris. Obviously, removing the contract ceiling just gives the contract a little bit more runtime and flexibility, and keeps us from having to do this GWAC again, 10 years from now. This is going to be a scorecard evaluation. So if you've been tracking this at all, you're probably already familiar with that. Most of the points come from project experience, right? Proven past performance, with some corporate level certifications thrown in there. And in terms of teaming right now, this is all contingent on the draft, right? Everything I'm about to share with you, but what's currently permitted in the draft, JVs are permitted in both the unrestricted and set-aside tracks. Same thing with CTAs, the contractor teaming arrangements. And right now, the prime-sub relationship is technically only allowed in the small business set-aside. So that's an interesting little nuance that right now in the unrestricted pool, there's not really a mechanism to team at the IDIQ level with the normal prime subs. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. And we would expect to see a lot more guidance or clarification around teaming. That's just been an area that's held up some of the previous GWACs. It's been an area of contention, I'd say, with industry, and probably it's an area where they got a lot of feedback on that first draft RFP. So in terms of timeline, they closed the Q&A period on the consolidated draft that they had released in November. That closed on the 31st of December. So new year, new you, right? Right now, we are waiting for a second draft RFP. There was a rumor that GSA might skip that second draft RFP and go straight to the final. I doubt that they will do that. They are on a very aggressive timeline. They're under a lot of pressure to get this out. They're also under a lot of pressure to do this right. So what we could see is a second draft RFP released sometime in the March timeframe that they don't include a Q&A period for. So it'd almost be a courtesy look at the second draft that incorporates whatever changes that they had from this first Q&A period. And then, in a rather accelerated fashion, we could go to the final. So still expecting this probably no earlier than April in terms of a final. But we're just kind of continuing to watch and wait. We've not seen any consolidated list of questions that were asked released yet. So I think that if we had a little bit of insight into that, we might have a better idea of the areas that they're addressing and the timeline for that. But as of right now, still expecting that second draft RFP in March. And the question mark is really how much time is going to be allowed between that and the final, and will GSA take feedback on that draft as well, or are they just going to move directly into the final solicitation and roll the dice with protests or questions or whatever's going to come from that? With Oasis Plus, obviously they're operating on a successful business model from Oasis, so some of the hiccups or challenges that they might have seen otherwise have already been worked through or addressed, and the legalities of what was or was not permitted. Not saying that there aren't still some challenges there, but they have a little bit of an advantage in that they can point to a successful program and say, look, this is what we've done before. There's precedence. It's worked. It's not disadvantaging people, which tends to be the thing that gets people in trouble, right? Is if you're disadvantaging a certain group. So we're keeping a close eye on it, listening for whispers and rumors, not to get people spun up, but just to keep you in the loop about what's actually going on. Okay, really quick, just to recap the areas of service. The 8 domains that are listed here, these are the ones that are planned for phase 1. There are some additional domains that are planned for phase 2, but we're going to get through these first ones. So the technical and engineering, research and development, logistics, management, advisory, and facilities, those are all kind of existing domains on the original Oasis program or the BMO contract, the base and maintenance or base maintenance operations. Building and maintenance operations contract that GSA has. Where we're seeing expanded scope is this intelligence services, the environmental domain, and the enterprise domain. And remember that enterprise domain is for the unrestricted track only. So we do see that expansion there. For phase 2, there's a couple other areas like financial services that GSA might expand into. They might roll over some of the HCATS work with the training, the human capital, that kind of work. But phase 2 is sort of not the alligator closest to the boat right now, so a lot of the attention is on these initial domains. And then if you've dug into that scorecard, which I hope you have, the project scoring areas, really you're going to get points for relevance, the scale of your projects, right, how much their annual value is. That's one of the nuances of Oasis, is that they're not looking at total contract value. You have to divide it out over the period of performance. Integrated experience, and really what that means, that combined with management and staffing, it's a capture of how complex the work is, right? If you're a prime and you're managing a lot of teammates, or if you're a small business and you're contributing a lot of cleared personnel, or if you're having to balance a lot of different labor flavors with a variety of LCATs, you're going to get some points for that. Past performance, this is to be expected, right? The quality of how well you've been doing your work, that's something that's going to get you points. Having federal competition, doing a task order in a federal competition multiple award environment, that would be something that gets you points. Having a broad diversity of federal customer agencies, that's something that would get you some points. The accounting system, this is consistent across the small business and the unrestricted tracks. One item of note is that in this latest draft RFP, I don't know if you noticed, but in the small business tracks, they actually removed the purchasing system, having that as being additional points. So that particular criteria is a little bit interesting to me, because that was a point of contention on Polaris, which was the IT small business set aside, and that, on that scorecard, having an approved purchasing system was worth about 1,000 points, and the total for the scorecard was 95,000 points. So, and that was not an area that a lot of small businesses were actually getting credit for. So to see GSA remove that from this is a little bit interesting to me, and I don't know what it means for Polaris, but that'll be a separate webinar, I'm sure. So moving on, just having the facility clearance, another way to get points, the corporate certifications, these are your ISO certs, the CMMI, and then the sustainability certs. This is an area that we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's kind of an area to watch, especially just based on the weighting of those points relative to the rest of the scorecard. So this is an area that GSA is trying to embrace and promote in terms of sustainability and making sure that you're environmentally friendly and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. But it's kind of a new zone for a lot of contractors. So I would not be surprised if we saw some revisions there, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So things that you can do now while you're waiting, right? A lot of this is going to sound like motherhood and apple pie, but it bears repeating because we see people make the same mistakes over and over. So getting into the draft RFP again, even if you've already read it, I have been in and out of this document since November, and I still feel like when I hear somebody talk about it, or when I sit down and think about the nuance, buried in certain areas, I'm learning something every time. And there are a lot of attachments that go along with this draft RFP as well. So if you haven't taken a look at JP5, which is the auto relevance coding sheet, right, that tells you where you're going to get the credit automatically for things, take a look at that. The project verification forms, just getting familiar with the fields that you're going to have to fill out and thinking about that in the terms of your projects that you have. Do you know what data is going to go where? Just make sure that you understand the latest guidance and really get into those attachments, because there's some details hidden in there that you don't want to be surprised by. The other thing you need to do is update your records and register in Symphony. So hopefully most of you have already had a little bit of familiarity with this platform, because this is where the Q&A were being taken for that draft RFP. But no worries if you haven't logged in here. We have tried to draw attention to it on this slide so that you can come back here. But what you need to understand is that so Symphony is the overall platform that GSA is using for these proposal submissions, but each proposal has its own, not Oasis proposal, but each GWAC has its own unique website address for this. So the Symphony for Polaris is a different website address than the Symphony for Oasis. So do make sure that you're registering for the right one. It's not just one registration for Symphony and you can see everything. You actually have to go to this distinct registration, log on. When you do that, you'll need to have your unique entity identification number, and you'll need to know your cage code, because that's how you will look up your company. You'll have to put in your multi-factor authentication method, and then you can get registered. And just keep in mind that Symphony is pulling data from sam.gov. So what you may want to do first is go to sam.gov and make sure that all of your entity registration is up to date, including your admins, because those are going to be the people who are actually authorized to approve other users in the Symphony portal. So if you're doing an address update, if you need to, like I said, update those admins or the point of contacts, this would be the time to do that. And I would start with sam.gov, just because getting things updated and replicated in that system can take a little bit of time, and then do your Symphony registration. Okay. And then if you have any questions about that, feel free to shoot us a note or pop them in the chat. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is perform an eligibility check. So Probably most people who are looking at Oasis know about where they stand, but we always encourage you to get into the weeds, go line by line, make sure that your SAM.gov registration is not about to expire, or that you haven't graduated from your small business size in certain NICS codes, or just based on how time goes by and how records can kind of fall off the radar. January is a great time anyway to do this for your business, and just make sure that everything is up to date. But go line by line, because most of the eligibility requirements are binary. But if you have a problem, it can take some time to resolve. So that's why we really encourage bidders or potential bidders to take a look at this now. It's if it's a yes, it's an easy yes. If it's a no, a lot of times there's a little bit more legwork involved and timeline required to get things fixed. So you just want to give yourself the best advantage and get those kind of low-hanging fruit type things taken care of, so that when you get the final solicitation, you can just keep pace with the changes and the amendments and the clarifications that we know are going to come as part of the dialogue that GSA has with industry. Gathering documentation and scoring your projects. This is absolutely vital while you have some time. So what we really encourage you to do is take all of the projects that you think might qualify and just score them up front. Get all of the information recorded, see what you have in black and white, especially for those contracts that have been going on for a while that have multiple amendments and modifications. It is really easy to drop a file in your archive or overlook that something was modified, or the period of performance was extended, or that a ceiling value changed, and maybe it didn't get updated in the rest of your databases. So remember that with these scorecard evaluations, the way that these work is that you're going to have to go through and tag with a comment in Adobe PDF. You're going to have to highlight the part that applies and tag it for GSA to read, so you can point to it and say, look, here, you don't have to take my word that it was a $7 million ceiling. It's right here in black and white. The period of performance went from this date to this date. So anytime you actually go through these documents and you see it yourself, you've just reduced your workload later down the road. And again, it's not so much for the easy yeses or the ones that are ready to go. What you're doing here is you're buying yourself time, because we have not come across anybody that's done an eligibility check for any of these yet that hasn't had some hiccup that they weren't expecting, right? Whether it was something was coded incorrectly, or they didn't actually have a signed copy of a modification or an amendment that got executed. There's all kinds of little issues like that, because humans are recording these things, right? So just make sure your documents say what you think they say, and we'll show you a sample tracker of how we do the projects as we're scoring them for our clients. Part and parcel with this is a great time to be talking to your customers, right? Whether it's prime work and it's the federal government, or you are a subcontractor and you're talking to your primes. If you think that you are going to use that work on Oasis, just go ahead and have the conversation now. Like, hey, we just wanted to give you a heads up. We are thinking about using this project. We're thinking it aligns to the technical and engineering domain. Are you going to be willing to sign a past performance questionnaire? Or, do you agree? This is especially important if you think you're going to claim an alternate alignment to one of the other domains, because maybe you have some R&D work, but you want to claim it for technical and engineering. Have the offline conversation with your customer first, right? Like, make sure that they are on board with that strategy and that they don't feel like you're going to be asking them to misrepresent anything. The best way to go into these conversations is by doing the legwork ahead of time on your side and saying, okay, here's what I would cite as evidence within my statement of work or my statement of objectives. Here's why I think it qualifies. And then just having a very non-time constrained, non-pressurized conversation with the client that says, hey, how would you feel about us using this work to represent this? We think we have a case. We just wanted to get your concurrence before we pursue this route. Because what's going to be really interesting about Oasis, I do expect there to be additional clarification around what to do for what you need to do for your evidence if something isn't clearly stated in black and white, right? So if it doesn't have an automatically relevant NICS code or PSC code, what's the document going to need to say? There's some interesting, not drama, but some back and forth with Polaris and the project verification forms that were used to substantiate project alignment to certain NICS codes, right? It was a similar exercise with Polaris, where we were trying to demonstrate relevance within certain IT NICS codes. And if you didn't have that, then you had to go through and tag the statement of work. In one of the variations of the project experience form that they released, they included a narrative block. And in fact, that narrative block had been there on Alliant. And it was for the emerging technology form, it included a narrative block as well. So there was some back and forth as to, okay, well, how much can we write about this to try and claim and make our case? And is GSA going to look at that? You know, are we going to be able to add a substantiating paragraph that explains what our thought process is? Or is this really just going to come down to having the core or the customer sign off on things? And as long as you've got that concurrence and something cited that, you know, meets the reasonable person standard of evidence and statement of work, will that be sufficient? So anyway, just greasing the skids ahead of time, making sure you've got concurrence and that your projects are going to count for what you think they're going to count for, at least, you know, external to GSA, is really important right now. And then thinking through your teaming strategy. So this is mostly for the small business bidders here, but don't just think about your qualifying score. Obviously, you have to get a foot in the door. You need to get on the IDIQ in order to compete for work and task orders, right? But think about how you're going to use this IDIQ in the long run for delivery. So what domains do you need? You might have a concentration based on auto-relevance NICS codes that is adjacent to what your core capability area is. So would you be better off teaming with somebody so that you can prime in one domain and sub in another? That's permitted as long as you're not crossing projects, and we'll talk about that in a second. But think through your teammate portfolio. Who have you worked with before? Who complements your capabilities? Right now, there's no penalty for working or forming a team with entities that you don't have that previous existing relationship with. We saw that on Polaris, right? If you teamed with somebody new just for the purpose of that bid, you took a pretty big scoring hit if you couldn't substantiate that you had performed in the same relationship that you were proposing on for Polaris. That doesn't exist right now on Oasis Plus. So you kind of have a free range to think through, right? Who's the person you'd like to take to the prom the most, right? Like who's going to compliment you? Who's got the best portfolio to help you get the qualifying score that you need? And you can go from there. But we just mention this so that you don't get too fixated on the goal of just winning the contract, right? With any of these GWACs, you want to make sure that they're going to be bringing you business or permitting you to do business in an area that makes sense for your business. Because GWACs aren't for everybody, right? If you have existing customers and you're doing great and Oasis, just the current Oasis program is not a vehicle that they use or are familiar with or are comfortable with, you might have a little bit of an uphill battle trying to bring them to that. It can be great for a lot of people, but it does take a little bit of work to maintain success in the long run on a GWAC because there's minimum contracting thresholds and things like that that are all very achievable if you're planning for them and working towards them. Okay, so I talked about the sample project tracker. Again, we just really encourage this legwork up front, right? What are you going to call each project, especially if you had, version A and version B, or phase 1 and phase 2? How are you going to get your nomenclature straight? What's the actual contract number? That's going to be the thing that you're looking for on every single piece of evidence that you submit. Does your statement of work actually have that contract number in the header or footer? You'd be surprised how many times it's really difficult to track pieces of the contract documentation that came from the same document, but if your default position was that you weren't going to believe it unless somebody proved it to you, that can cause some issues in your evidence. So taking a look right now, what's the contract number that's tying everything together? Was it prime experience? Was it federal experience? Who was the prime vendor if it wasn't you? Is that the same entity listed in FPDS? Or was it a subsidiary of your company, in which case you might need a meaningful relationship commitment letter. These fields were chosen for very specific reasons because they're going to tell you if it triggers another piece of documentation that you need. What was the start date? What was the end date? How many days did that end up being? What was your total contract value? Remember here that if work is completed, you only get to take credit for the actual obligated funds. So it's very easy to determine that in an FPDS record. It's less easy to do that on subcontracting work, and you might need invoices to substantiate, the contract ceiling was $13.5 million, and we actually billed that much money. What was the annual value? That's going to be the threshold that determines whether or not a project qualifies as being a qualifying project, right? That's the first thing you got to look at was the recency and the size. Same thing with total obligated amount, what actually got funded to it, what was the project's assigned NICS code or PSC code, does that have automatic alignment? If it doesn't, what else could you possibly claim? It might be that you had a project coded in a NICS code or PSC code that's not one of the automatic relevant codes that's being advertised right now. So where would you align it? Or do you have a project that crosses multiple domains where maybe you could get credit for management and advisory or technical and engineering? Just getting that kind of lineup at the outset will help, because when you're looking at your projects in total, the thing that's going to get you the highest score in a domain is having a concentration of relevant qualifying projects. So you can include up to 5 qualifying projects per domain. And if you were on a little bit before we started, there was a question about whether federal experience can be in addition to those. And the answer is yes, but they're not necessarily going to count as relevant projects, right? That's a different set of criteria. So just making sure you can kind of see what coverage you have and what concentrations you have is a great starting point to let you know where your gaps are, so that you can spend the time between now and the final chasing down projects that might fill those things in. So really what you want to do is keep it simple. Make sure that you're only recording the values that you can prove, right? This shouldn't be things that you know to be true. They should be things that you can prove are true. And then we do encourage you to evaluate more projects than you think you'll need. So if you've got 5 projects and they are fantastic projects, like there's no harm in listing those first, but I would have some backup projects, because the timing on this gets a vote. There could be changes in criteria that make some of your other projects ineligible all of a sudden. So just having a little bit of a backup, a little bit of a cushion is a healthy approach at this stage. And then keeping this up to date, right? As projects end, remember, you're going to be shifting from getting credit for whatever the total ceiling value was and dividing that out over the total period of performance to whatever the actual obligated amount was. And in some cases, that could knock a project out of eligibility very quickly. So encourage you to capture all your information, keep it up to date during this time before the final. So some areas to watch and some contingencies that exist within the scorecard. You've probably picked up on these, but just in case, I want to run through them real quick. So the relevant versus non-relevant project experience. So relevance definitely matters most, right? If you've looked at the scorecard, then you know that relevant projects tend to get 4 points per project, and a non-relevant qualifying project gets 0. That's a huge difference if you're talking about having 3 relevant projects and 2 non-relevant projects versus 5 relevant projects. So in general, more relevant projects is better. But scale and complexity are also critical. If you have just 5 relevant projects and you're not getting any of the extra points, you're not going to make the minimum score for the minimum qualifying threshold for the domains. You have to be able to have a couple plus ups in some of the areas to get to that minimum score. And then also keep in mind that only your relevant qualifying projects are eligible for past performance points. So if you have 5 relevant qualifying projects and you had good past performance and a satisfactory or higher on all of them, then the most points you can get is actually 3. So this is not a 1-for-1 thing where if you have 5 projects, you get 5 points. You max out at 3, and that's only if all 5 relevant projects have satisfactory performance. If you're only submitting 3 relevant projects in a domain, the most points you could get for past performance is 1. So you have to have a minimum of 3 relevant past performance, satisfactory past performance projects in order to even get 1 point in that category. So that's just one of those areas where we're going to watch it for changes, but also you have to make sure you're doing your math correctly and not making assumptions. So really make sure you're paying attention to the max points that are allowable per field so that you're not artificially inflating your score. The other one is domain alignment, and I think we're going to see some more clarifying information from GSA in the next iteration of this draft or even in the final. The fundamental question is, how many hats can one project really wear? Because if you think about this, the way that the GSA has given guidance so far about determining relevance on a project is that, so first off, the easy button is that it's automatically coded as something, right? It's automatically coded as engineering work, or it's automatically coded as research and design. or research and development. If that's the case, you don't have to go very far in providing additional documentation. If that's not the case, if it's not an automatically relevant NICS code, then the example that they've given is citing the funding at the CLIN level, which, if depending on how your documentation depending on how your contract documentation looks for your contract, you may or may not have that level of detail that breaks out each CLIN based on what it was for. So especially this is true for like a firm fixed price contract. Excuse me. It's going to be really difficult to prove that you met the minimum annual value in a way that was relevant to research and development on a technical and engineering document. So it's not just as simple as pulling something in the statement of work that says, this is the kind of work we were doing and the nature of it aligns to this domain. You're going to have to get into the nitty-gritty of the actual funding. And so I could see that being pretty tricky or pretty sticky, especially on some of the smaller projects. Okay, so for the federal customers, already alluded to this, but don't forget that you can use additional projects to claim those points, and there are different minimum values and criteria that apply. So be sure to dig into that solicitation and take a look. The minimum annual threshold for most of the projects in the small business realm, somewhere in the $250K to $500K range. For the federal experience, it's much lower. It's $250K right now. So, and it doesn't have to be $250K that was relevant to a particular domain. It just has to be for a federal customer. So keep that in mind as you're looking at your project lineup. And that's another area where taking a look at more projects than you think you might need might buy you a little bit of flexibility. Okay, so if you're bidding on multiple teams, because I know that some people just want to get their best chance of success, the way to do that is to diversify or align yourself with as many advocates as possible. So if you do that, I just want to make you aware of a couple things. If you have a really good qualifying experience, we're just going to call it qualifying project number one. If you are bidding as a prime in the technical and engineering domain on the small business track and the hub zone track, then you can use that project in both of those proposals without penalty. So you can use it as a prime in the technical and engineering domain small business proposal. You can use it as a prime in the technical and engineering domain on the hub zone solicitation and not have any kind of duplicate penalty, no issues with that. You can use that project on the hub zone T&E. You can give it to a subcontractor to use in the small business solicitation. That's also okay. So you could use it on your own prime bid in a hub zone. You could use it on a small business as someone's teammate. What you can't do is use it in your own prime bid on the small business solicitation and give that project to your teammate to use in their small business bid. So anytime you're using a project in the same domain and solicitation, and by solicitation they mean the hub zone, the woman-owned, the 8A, whatever the designation of the solicitation is. I know that language gets a little confusing. That is not permitted, and it's in fact going to get removed from all the proposals. So if you had used that project on your T&E domain in your small business bid and your hub zone bid, and then also given it to somebody else, it's not going to count for anybody. So just be very careful about, if you're on this team, making sure you know who's using what project and where else it's making an appearance. You don't want to get that project disqualified. Okay, so areas to watch. And this is, again, I don't have a crystal ball. This is just based on some conversations that we've had with customers or potential clients and things that we've seen on other GWACs. And John, I saw you typing, so if you have a question, keep typing. I'm going to keep talking. So OTA documentation. OTAs are kind of funny in that they weren't even really acknowledged as being eligible to be counted as a project until until kind of midway through the Polaris bids. And so they are permitted right now, based on the draft RFP, they are permitted to qualify as projects on Oasis Plus if they meet certain criteria. But what's really not clear is if the government is going to count these as prime or sub work and what they're going to accept as documentation. And what I mean by that is that for a lot of the consortiums, the funding actually gets awarded to the consortium, not to the performing entity. The performing entity is designated by a sub-performer agreement, so from the consortium to whoever the prime is. But if you look at what the standards of evidence are right now in the solicitation, a sub-performer agreement is not an accepted way to prove that you are the prime on something. The default answer is that FPDS designates who the prime contractor is, or there's a contract award document, which is usually a government form that specifies that. So what are they going to allow? Because it does happen on some OTAs that they go directly to the standard or the more traditional prime contractor. But for those that go as basically a pass through the consortium, how are they going to count that? And I don't think we know the answer to that. I know it's been asked, but it's kind of an area to watch. So the other thing that's interesting about OTAs is that they are primarily designed for research and development type work. And in fact, if you look at the USC code that's referenced in the solicitation, that talks about DoD using OTAs for research and development type work. So is GSA going to entertain OTAs counting outside of the R&D domain, since there's already this home where they're automatically relevant? And again, if they do that, how would you substantiate that they meet the minimum threshold? Because these tend to be firm fixed price projects that have milestone payments. They're not tied to labor categories or your more traditional structures that would be easier to prove with a line item. So I think that's an area to watch and hopefully get some more clarification around. With the teaming limitations, this is something that caused a lot of contention on Polaris was, what are the minimum project contributions for different set-asides? So if you're submitting a women-owned small business bid, are you as the prime and presumably the set-aside offerer, are you going to have to contribute a minimum number of the qualifying projects, with the intent being that you bring some of the experience, right? So you can't just use a small business set-aside as the front prime offer for a bid. They actually need to contribute something as well. Are we going to see something where they say, at least 2 of the relevant projects, or at least a certain number of points must come from the business with a socioeconomic designation? I don't know. And we've already talked about this a little bit, where right now the traditional prime sub relationships are really only specified at in the small business RFP. That there's a whole paragraph that's just not in the large business or the unrestricted solicitation. So certainly an area to watch. And we just know that teaming, there's going to be a lot of questions around that anyway, especially when you start to pull in the mentor proteges and the joint ventures, where people start to feel like there might be an unfair disadvantage, or there's a provable disadvantage numerically if you're allowed to rely on pretty much the experience of one entity. So just keep in mind too that with the teaming limitations in the small business domains, every entity that's on the team for the small business tracks also needs to be considered a small business in whatever the primary NICS code is for the domain that you're pursuing. So if you're a small business in 541330 and you're teaming with 3 other companies, they all also need to be small businesses under 541330. Just take a look at that as you're forming your strategy. Make sure that you're not unintentionally disadvantaging yourself or your team from consideration because you've invited somebody onto the team that doesn't actually qualify. Okay, and then the other area to watch would be the domain thresholds and NICS alignment. So these have actually not changed too much throughout the iterations of the drafts of Oasis Plus. But if these thresholds changed, if these minimum annual thresholds changed, or if the NICS codes that were associated with the domains changed, that could drive some pretty significant changes to your scorecard. So this will be an area where we're encouraging you to do your eligibility check now, do your project lineup now. But those should also be the first things that you check once we get that final solicitation, just to confirm that nothing changed. And all of a sudden you've got 2 projects worth 12 points that you can't use. That would be a deal breaker on the scorecard, right? If you're only working with 36 points out of 50 to start with, and you don't want to lose any points. So. Okay, so some key takeaways, next steps. Prepping up front to reduce the churn down the road is, 100% the best thing that you can do right now. Because as we've talked, if you've been on any of these webinars before, if you were with us for Polaris, you spend a lot of time getting organized up front so that when the changes happen, when there's amendments, when there's pauses, when there's protests that drive changes to the solicitation, you can do a really quick reevaluation of your stance in your portfolio and either pivot quickly to another strategy, or you can come up with that plan B if you need it, right? It's really difficult to do this in the moment. And if you're like, hey, I had 5 projects and I don't have anything in backup, or I have some other projects, but I haven't scored any of them, so I don't know where I'm at. It's easier to do that. And I know there's always another alligator that's close to the boat, but it's easier to do that now before you're under the time crunch of the final solicitation. Getting things in writing. So making sure that your documentation matches. I cannot foot stomp this enough. Even companies that are really meticulous with data and record keeping find surprises. Or the other thing that sometimes we find is that because these bids, this might be the first scorecard bid that your company's gone after, especially if you're a small business. And it might be that, there's one branch of your company that's responsible for maintaining all of the past performance volumes. And then there's another branch that's responsible for all of the financial files. And so making sure that you tell people what you're going to need ahead of time so that they're not surprised by it, or if they have to go find the file, or if they have to go recreate the record, they can do that with enough time that you're not waiting at the 11th hour for somebody to send you a piece of documentation that's going to make or break the eligibility of the project that you're trying to use. Reading and rereading everything. I know I mentioned this. I've been living and breathing this draft, and I'm still finding things that are not surprising, but that it takes a couple times of seeing it for it to really sink in and to be able to understand how to apply the criteria. And then getting help if you're out of your depth. There's no shame in having a second set of eyes, whether it's internal or external, to make sure that someone is looking at what you're seeing and interpreting it the same way. Because, I have my little Venn diagram here on the side, right? The things that are going to influence your score are the timing of the solicitation, your performance and preparation, the solicitation requirements, and then your customer's acknowledgement. And you really only have control over one of these 4 factors, right? You can control how well you're performing and how well you prepare. You can't control when the solicitation comes out, but that's going to affect what projects you can use and what values get calculated. You can't control whether or not your customer is going to agree with your strategy and sign forms on time, or, concur with your realignment or your alternate alignment. And GSA is pretty good about taking industry feedback, but at the end of the day, they get to set what the solicitation requirements are, and we only have so much influence over that. So the thing that you can control now is how well you prepare. So I just want to emphasize that for everyone. Okay, sales portion of this. If you do find that you need a little bit of extra help, we do have packages available in varying sizes. So at the lower end, if you just need some additional resources where you want to be able to reach out, look at a how-to guide, if you have questions about how to fill something out, the Tier 1 package is probably for you. So if you already know what you're doing with scorecard evaluations, if you've been through a lot of these and you're just looking for some Oasis-specific help, this Tier 1 package is great. We're going to continue doing our webinars. This is actually our last free webinar today. After this, we're going to shift to the sort of client portfolio only, where every 2 weeks or so, just depending on how things are coming from GSA, we might do them more frequently or less frequently as needed, but we'll continue our webinar series. You'll have the chance to do in these small sessions, you can ask an expert. We're not going to look at your specific documents for your company, but we can answer questions about whatever you're facing. We're also going to have a training video library that you can get into, and we'll keep you updated as RFP updates come out, amendments, changes like that. You kind of get a direct line through one of our experts. If you have some experience with scorecard evaluations and you're really just looking for that second set of eyes to kind of augment your proposal and make sure that you know what you're doing in Symphony and that you have this unbiased look at your documentation, then the Tier 2 package might be a good option for you. This is what we call our coach and review package. So you get everything with Tier 1, so all of those tools. Plus, we're going to get you a proposal document tracker. We're going to actually review your documents. You're going to mark them up, but we're going to review them and make sure that we agree with what you flagged, that you've got your tags right. It's a compliance check. It's an eligibility check. And then the scorecard validation, right? So we'll start by making sure that you self-assessed correctly, and then doing a one-on-one biweekly meeting once the solicitation comes out so that you can come, you can ask questions, we can talk through teaming strategies, we can, like I said, look at your company's specific documentation and help you point out any gaps or get prepped on that side. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have the Done For You package, which is really designed for the teams that need comprehensive support or might be totally new to scorecard evaluation. So it might be that you're just really busy with other pursuits, and this is something that's easy for you to offload. That's totally fine. With this one, this is the most hands-on intensive package that we have, where basically you send us your documents, we tell you what you need to do, we mark them up, we'll tell you what to put in your request to your customers, we'll fill out the project verification forms for you if those are needed, and then we'll help you with the actual upload when it comes time within Symphony. So we do offer a spectrum of support just based on what you and your team need. And if you have any questions about that, or if you want to talk about your specific situation, please feel free to get in touch with us. Prices are, that always comes up. So there are set prices for these. The tier 1 is a monthly retainer. I think right now it's $950. With tier 2, what you do is you pay a retainer upfront and then a monthly fee for continued service. And right now, I think that's set at $7,500 for the retainer. If during that check we find that you are not eligible for any reason, a portion of that is refundable. So you're basically paying for an eligibility check. But from signing through submission, you pay that upfront retainer and then a monthly fee of $500. And then the tier 3, that's one firm fixed price. Doesn't matter if this solicitation runs for 2 months or 8 months. And it's $30K. Which I know sounds like a lot, but if you divide it out based on the work that gets done on a monthly basis and the number of projects, then it's actually a pretty affordable deal, which is why it's our most popular package. So if you have questions about any of that, the best thing to do is actually set up a call with us and we can walk you through what might make sense for your company. And there are some little variations in there, right? If you're forming a really complex team, or if you're bidding on multiple domains, there might be an additional fee applied just based on that specific circumstance. But we can walk you through all those ins and outs. And if you're really not sure, if you're on the fence and you just want an eligibility check, that's an option as well. But we want to talk to you if you think that you're in that boat, just so we can kind of get an understanding of where you're at, what prep you've done, and make sure that it's something that would make sense for you. Because we want you to get value out of this. And we want to make sure that if we form a relationship, that it's in everybody's best interest. So happy to talk through any of that if there are additional questions. Okay, so I'm going to stay online for a little while. I see some people typing, so that's great. If you have questions, feel free to ask. And like I said, you can shoot me an email or you can get in touch with us on our website using our contact form if you want to set up a one-on-one call. I'm going to stop the recording at this point. That way, if you have questions that are sensitive or if you don't want everybody to know or for this to live in perpetuity, no issues. We can have an offline or at least an unrecorded conversation. So for everybody else, thank you so much for dialing in. And again, my apologies for the technical difficulties if you got any of those notices before this for a webinar that didn't happen. We will post this recording to our Oasis hub on our website. Like I said, this is the last free one. But yes, we will post this presentation, at least the recording of it, so that you can reference back to it or share it with others in your organization.